Hi, welcome to the second short lecture from Chapter 10. In this short lecture, we're going to talk more about race in organizational communication. And we'll start with a little bit of historical context, as we like to do. So what we find, of course, is that for most of the 20th century, organizations were dominated by white males. According to your book, at least, diversity and difference among employees did not register as an issue. And this is due, in no small part, to the fact that whiteness, because it was the norm, right, became kind of invisible, right? When you see something all the time, you cease to see it anymore, right? You take it for granted, and it sort of becomes, because it's the norm, sort of the standard against which everything else is measured, right? So what we found, particularly during the last century, was that when corporations did engage in tokenism, when there were token women or people of color in organizations, in managerial positions, oftentimes they were not put in these managerial positions until there was already sort of a crisis going on in the organization. And so as a result, right, we talked a little bit about the glass cliff, for example, in the last chapter, and about how when women were put in CEO positions, oftentimes it was because the organization wanted to, was already failing and wanted radical change, quote unquote, and so put a woman in charge. And of course, it's much harder to pull a failing organization out of free fall than it is to continue and prosper with a healthy organization, right? So when this happens, and when token employees failed, this reinforces the natural order. The idea is, oh, well, look what happens, of course you can't hire a woman, and that kind of thing. This white male norm also served to obscure the fact that there were a lot of women and people of color in the workplace, just usually at lower levels of organizations. For example, secretarial pools were consistently made up entirely of women, right? And they vastly outnumbered the number of executives that were in most organizations, but yet this wasn't really considered when people thought about these organizations and when the organization imagined its own character and its own identity, right? When we did recognize race, unfortunately, in the context of 20th century organizations, oftentimes it was done in an effort to gain further control, right, over employees. And so a perfect example of this was Ford Motor Company's sociological department. So this is Ford, the same people that make the F-150 and the Mustang and so on, right? So Henry Ford famously decided that he was going to pay his employees what he thought was a living wage, which at the time was a fair amount of money, and that was $5 a day, right? And so Ford came out in public, and the Ford Motor Company came out and said that the reason that they were doing this was because he wanted to make sure that his employees had enough money to buy their cars, right? That they should have enough money to buy the products that they manufacture, and that sounded really good and democratic and egalitarian. But the truth is a little bit it's a little bit darker, right? The truth is when historians have really examined this, what they find is that Ford went to that $5 an hour simply because he was having trouble keeping employees. And turnover was costing him more than it would have cost for him to pay a reasonable wage. In any event, so the $5 a day job at Ford was one that was considered quite prestigious among working people at the time, right? So in 1913, Ford put together what he called a sociological department. And these departments had investigators that went out to where the employees were living to make sure that they were living, quote, clean, sober, industrious, and thrifty private lives worthy of their $5 a day wage. So if you can imagine your employer coming to your house and making sure that you were keeping things clean and tidy, and that you were acting in a moral fashion and so on, that's exactly what he did. And of course, many of these workers were African Americans who had migrated from the South after the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction, right, in order to get work. And so this surveillance program was really kind of an offshoot of a larger moral panic that focused on African American migration during the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century when African Americans moved from the South to the North, right? And so there were concerns associated with this, right? That constructed this kind of moral panic. So the idea was that much of this was related to alcohol, to jazz music, which was viewed as particularly pernicious. And so Ford, who, by the way, was a notorious anti-Semite as well, he really hated Jewish people, he put together this department to go out and inspect his employees, and clearly this is an effort at control, right? I mean, it's a power flex. And it's one that's put together because African American culture at the time was constructed as a threat to the white social order, right? So during the late 19th and early 20th century, we see that there is a debate concerning whiteness, right? So you hear about blackness a lot in popular culture and in the media today, but I guess if there's a flip side to that, it's this idea of whiteness. So during the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was considerable debate in the United States as to who was white, what whiteness is, and what it entails, right? And so as a result of this, you have to remember, too, that this was a time where we see waves of immigrants entering the United States, and Italian-American immigrants specifically suffered a lot under this discussion of whiteness and this value system that we ascribe to race. And indeed, Italian Americans were not considered white during this period of time. So much so that in the South, if you were an Italian American immigrant, your child was assigned to all black schools in the South, right, to segregated schools. And we see a famous incident, it's famous in scholarship and in the academy, but most people don't know about it. In 1911, we saw 11 Italian Americans lynched in Louisiana, right? So it's important to recognize that these notions of whiteness, for example, what makes up whiteness, or who or what is white, or who or what is black, or who is what is anything, this is the socially constructed part, right? The part where we assign values to things and make kind of arbitrary decisions. But these decisions, of course, have massive consequences, in particular, if you're in danger of being killed, right? So these distinctions, even though they seem illogical, point out the socially constructed and fluid construction of race. So nowadays, of course, when we talk about race and ethnicity and we take it seriously, we're usually talking about managing diversity. And there's a major push now, of course, in most large Western organizations for diversity. And the logic behind this is that organizations that don't develop a diverse workforce are going to hurt their bottom line because they don't really draw on the full range of skill sets offered by the entire working population. You're not getting, and honestly, by the way, this is really kind of a sick way of justifying diversity, right? The case here is not that, hey, we're all created equal and everyone gets a job. The case here is, listen, you need a diverse workforce because you'll make more money, which strikes me as a deeply unethical way to discuss diversity, right, and to justify inclusiveness. So today, when we examine race from an organizational communication perspective, we understand that it is an everyday feature of organizational life. We also realize through studies that just as organizations and occupations can be gendered, they also can be raced. So we talked about this a little bit in some of the prior lectures. For example, when I told you about the male daycare teacher, right, that I ran into and thought that was odd, right, because I suggested to you that the daycare teacher position is a gendered position and one typically associated with women. So at this point, I normally would ask you if we were all in person, and maybe I could do this when we meet next week, but can we think of raced organizations or occupations? And I think we probably can, right? And then once we identify these, I want to ask you what the cultural logic is behind these constructions. Why do we think, for example, of and we can do it with gender too. Why would I be sort of surprised or startled to see a man working in a daycare, right? What's the cultural logic that is underneath, that informs my surprise? What is it that makes me sort of freaked out by this, for lack of a better term? And I mean, I think in that case, the cultural logic is that we view it specifically as a gendered job because we're talking about small children, and traditionally the rearing of small children has been something that's been done by women, right? We view women as more compassionate, as more empathetic, as more nurturing, right? So that would be the cultural logic. So according to all this, we need to look at race not just in individual terms, but as a structural aspect of organizations and society, and one that shapes meanings, values, and people's identities, of course. All right, that's it for this one. Next lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about whiteness, other organizations, right, and affirmative action.